In the frozen forests of Belgium during the brutal winter of 1944, a German colonel stood beside rows of abandoned American fuel trucks, their precious cargo still intact, and felt the weight of an empire crumbling beneath his feet. This was not supposed to happen this way. The fuel he had captured represented millions of gallons of gasoline, diesel, and oil, enough to power his armored division across Belgium and deep into Allied territory, enough to change the course of the war, enough to give Germany one final chance at victory. But as he walked among these treasures of war, touching the cold metal drums and reading the English markings on the containers, something inside him broke. The fuel was there, the prize was won, but Germany had already lost. The colonel's name was Joachim Paper, and the moment he realized his nation was doomed would become one of the most haunting turning points of World War II, a moment when hope died in the eyes of a true believer, when reality crashed through the walls of propaganda and faith. This is the story of that moment, the story of a soldier who discovered that victory was already impossible even as he held the keys to continue fighting, and the story of how one man's realization reflected the death of an entire regime. Joachim Paper was born on January 30th, 1915, in Berlin, Germany, into a world that was already tearing itself apart. His father had served in the German Imperial Army during World War I, and the family carried the scars of that devastating conflict like invisible wounds that never healed. Young Joachim grew up in the Weimar Republic, that chaotic period between the wars when Germany struggled under the crushing weight of the Treaty of Versailles, when inflation destroyed the economy, when veterans begged in the streets, and when political extremism flourished in the soil of desperation and humiliation. The boy watched his country suffer, watched his father's generation broken by defeat, watched as proud men were reduced to selling their medals for bread. In school, teachers spoke of the injustice done to Germany, of the betrayal by politicians who signed the armistice, of the glorious empire that had been stolen from the German people. Joachim absorbed these lessons like a sponge, his young mind filling with resentment, nationalism, and a burning desire to restore his nation's honor. He was intelligent, disciplined, and deeply idealistic, qualities that would shape his entire life and lead him down a path from which there could be no return. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party seemed to young Paper like the answer to everything that had gone wrong. Here was a movement that promised to restore Germany's greatness, to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, to rebuild the military, and to make Germans proud again. Joachim joined the Hitler Youth with enthusiasm, throwing himself into the training, the marching, the ceremonies, and the ideology. He was a natural leader, tall and handsome with sharp features and piercing eyes that radiated confidence and determination. His instructors noticed his potential immediately. The boy had an exceptional ability to command respect, to inspire others, and to execute orders with precision. When he turned 18 in 1933, the same year Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, Paper made the decision that would define his existence. He joined the SS, the elite paramilitary organization that saw itself as the racial and ideological vanguard of the Nazi movement. This was not the regular army, not the traditional military his father had served in, but something new, something radical, something that demanded absolute loyalty to Hitler and absolute commitment to the Nazi vision of racial supremacy and territorial expansion. Paper's career in the SS accelerated with remarkable speed. He was exactly the kind of young man the organization wanted, educated, athletic, fanatically devoted, and willing to embrace the brutal ideology without question. He trained at the SS officer school in Brunswick, where he learned tactics, strategy, leadership, and the racial theories that formed the foundation of Nazi philosophy. His instructors wrote glowing reports about his abilities, noting his tactical intelligence, his physical courage, and his unwavering commitment to the cause. By 1938, when he was just 23 years old, Paper had caught the attention of Heinrich Himmler himself, the head of the entire SS organization. Himmler, always looking for capable and loyal young officers to advance, brought Paper into his personal staff as an adjutant. This was an extraordinary opportunity that placed the young officer at the very center of Nazi power, giving him access to the highest levels of decision-making and exposing him to the inner workings of the regime. Working directly for Himmler meant that Paper witnessed things that most soldiers never saw. He attended meetings where the extermination of Jewish people was discussed as casually as one might discuss crop yields or factory production. He saw the plans for the invasion of Poland, the strategies for crushing France, the dreams of conquering the Soviet Union and creating a vast German empire across Europe. He accompanied Himmler on inspection tour of conquered territories, seeing firsthand how the SS operated in occupied lands, how they dealt with resistance, how they implemented the racial policies that would lead to genocide. Through all of this, Paper remained a true believer. He saw no contradiction between his own sense of honor and the horrific crimes being committed in the name of his ideology. Like many young Nazis, he had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that he could not see the evil right in front of his eyes. He genuinely believed that Germany was fighting for its survival, that harsh measures were necessary, that the ends justified the means. This blindness, this willing embrace of propaganda over reality, would shape everything that followed. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Paper finally got his wish to lead combat troops. He was given command of a company in the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the elite armored unit that bore the Führer's name. The Eastern Front was unlike anything the world had ever seen, a titanic struggle between two totalitarian systems, fought across thousands of miles with a brutality that defied comprehension. Paper threw himself into the fighting with ferocious energy. He led his tanks deep into Soviet territory, participating in the initial victories that saw the Wehrmacht advance hundreds of miles, capturing millions of prisoners and destroying countless Soviet divisions. He fought in the terrible battles around Kiev, where entire Soviet armies were encircled and annihilated. He experienced his first Russian winter, when temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and German soldiers froze to death in their positions because they lacked winter clothing and equipment. The Eastern Front changed Paper in ways he did not fully understand at the time. He became harder, more ruthless, more willing to do whatever was necessary to achieve victory. He saw his men die in horrible ways, burned alive in their tanks, cut down by Soviet machine guns, frozen in the snow. He saw Soviet soldiers fight with a desperation and courage that surprised him, their willingness to die rather than surrender, their ability to endure conditions that would have broken Western armies. He also participated in actions against civilians, in reprisal killings, in the burning of villages suspected of harboring partisans. The line between soldier and war criminal began to blur, and Paper crossed it without hesitation, convinced that he was fighting a war of annihilation where normal rules did not apply. His superiors loved him for this ruthlessness. He was promoted rapidly, given more responsibility, awarded medals for bravery and leadership. By 1943, he had risen to command an entire tank battalion, one of the most prestigious positions a young officer could hold in the German military. Paper developed a reputation as one of the most skilled and aggressive tank commanders in the entire German military. His tactics emphasized speed, surprise, and overwhelming violence. He would strike fast, penetrate deep into enemy positions, cause chaos and confusion, then withdraw before the enemy could organize a counterattack. He trained his men relentlessly, demanding perfection in gunnery, navigation, communication, and coordination. His battalion became known as the tip of the spear, the unit that would lead the most difficult assaults, the formation that could be counted on to break through when others failed. He fought in the massive tank battle at Kursk in summer 1943, where hundreds of German and Soviet tanks clashed in the largest armored engagement in history. Though the battle ended in strategic defeat for Germany, Paper's unit distinguished itself, destroying numerous Soviet tanks and holding critical positions against overwhelming odds. But even as paper won his tactical victories, the strategic situation continued to deteriorate. The Soviet Union was not collapsing as Hitler had predicted. Instead, it was growing stronger, producing tanks and aircraft in vast numbers, replacing its losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The tide was turning, though true believers like Paper refused to see it. He convinced himself that Germany's superior skill and technology would eventually prevail, that one more offensive, one more breakthrough would bring the Soviets to their knees. He ignored the evidence accumulating around him: the shrinking German armies, the fuel shortages, the lack of replacement equipment, the exhaustion visible in every soldier's face. His faith in ultimate victory remained intact because admitting defeat would mean acknowledging that everything he had fought for, everything he had done, had been for nothing. This psychological need to believe, to maintain faith despite mounting evidence, would drive his actions in the final desperate months of the war. By autumn 1944, Germany's military situation had become catastrophic. The Soviet Union had liberated its own territory and was pushing into Poland and Romania. The Western Allies had landed in Normandy, broken out of their beachhead, liberated France, and were approaching Germany's western border. German cities were being pounded into rubble by Allied bombers flying missions day and night. The rational thing would have been to seek peace, to negotiate some kind of settlement before everything was lost. But Adolf Hitler was not rational. He was desperate, delusional, and determined to fight until either Germany won or Germany was destroyed. In his headquarters, surrounded by maps showing his shrinking empire, Hitler conceived a plan so audacious that many of his generals thought he had gone completely insane. He would launch a massive counteroffensive in the west, driving through the Ardennes forest just as Germany had done in 1940, splitting the Allied armies, capturing the vital port of Antwerp, and forcing the Americans and British to negotiate a separate peace. With the Western Allies neutralized, Germany could then turn all its strength against the Soviets. The plan required everything Germany had left: 30 divisions, hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and the entire strategic reserve of fuel that had been hoarded for months. The operation would be called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, to deceive Allied intelligence into thinking it was a defensive measure. Paper's unit, now expanded to a full combat group called Kampfgruppe Paper, was assigned a critical role. He would lead the main penetration, driving his tanks and mechanized infantry 60 miles from the German start line to the Meuse River in just 2 days, moving so fast that the Americans would not have time to organize a defense. If he succeeded, other German units would follow through the gap he created, and the entire Allied front would collapse. It was a suicide mission disguised as a strategic masterstroke, dependent on perfect weather to ground Allied aircraft, on complete surprise, on American incompetence, and most critically, on capturing American fuel supplies to keep the German tanks moving. Every German officer involved in planning the Ardennes offensive knew that fuel was the mission's Achilles heel. Germany's oil production had been devastated by Allied bombing. The synthetic fuel plants that had kept the Wehrmacht running were now destroyed or operating at a fraction of capacity. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, which had supplied much of Germany's fuel, were now in Soviet hands. Every drop of gasoline and diesel had to be carefully rationed. The panzers assembled for the offensive had just enough fuel to reach the Meuse River if everything went perfectly, if they encountered no resistance, if they never had to detour or fight extended battles. But everyone knew that was impossible. Wars never went according to plan. There would be delays, detours, unexpected resistance, traffic jams on narrow forest roads. The fuel would run out long before the objectives were reached unless the Germans could capture American supplies. This was not just speculation. The plan explicitly depended on seizing Allied fuel dumps. German intelligence had identified several major American supply depots in Belgium containing millions of gallons of fuel, positioned there to support the Allied advance into Germany. Paper was specifically ordered to capture these fuel stocks intact. His route was chosen partly to bring him past known fuel storage sites. The success of the entire offensive, the fate of Hitler's last gamble, rested on the assumption that American fuel would power the German advance. When Paper received these orders, he understood their implications perfectly. He was being asked to drive deep into enemy territory with barely enough fuel to get there, gambling that he could capture the enemy's supplies before his own tanks ran dry. It was insane, desperate, and typical of Germany's situation in late 1944. But Paper was a soldier who followed orders, a true believer who still thought Germany could win, and a commander arrogant enough to think he could succeed where logic said he should fail. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, 1,000 German artillery pieces opened fire along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes. The barrage was devastating, raining shells down on American positions, cutting communications, destroying command posts, and creating panic and confusion. The Americans, thinly spread in what they thought was a quiet sector, were completely unprepared. Many units were overrun in the first hours. Others retreated in disorder. The German infantry advanced through the morning fog, infiltrating American lines, bypassing strong points, pushing deep into the rear areas. Behind the infantry came the panzers, their engines roaring, their tracks churning up the frozen ground. Paper's Kampfgruppe was supposed to advance in the afternoon of the first day, following a route that other units would clear for them. But the other units made slower progress than expected, running into stubborn American resistance, getting stuck in traffic jams, failing to open the roads. Paper grew furious as he waited. Every hour of delay meant more time for the Americans to organize their defense, more time for their aircraft to arrive when the weather cleared, more fuel consumed by idling engines. Finally, he decided he could wait no longer. He ordered his column to move forward using whatever roads were available, bypassing the traffic jams, pushing aside slower units, forcing his way to the front. His command consisted of over 100 tanks and armored vehicles, thousands of infantry riding in half-tracks, artillery pieces, engineers, and support vehicles, all strung out in a massive column that stretched for miles. The narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes were never designed for this kind of traffic. Vehicles got stuck, roads became clogged, commanders lost contact with their units. But Paper drove them forward relentlessly, screaming at anyone who caused delay, threatening to shoot soldiers who did not move fast enough, displaying the ruthless determination that had made him famous. By the evening of December 16th, Paper's Kampfgruppe had advanced only about half as far as planned, but they had broken through the American front line and were now operating in the rear areas where resistance was scattered and disorganized. They rolled through small Belgian villages, their tanks and half-tracks filled with cold, exhausted soldiers who had been fighting or marching for nearly 20 hours. The local Belgian civilians watched in terror as the Germans returned, having been liberated by the Americans just months before. Paper had no time for civilians. His orders were to advance at maximum speed, to reach the Meuse River bridges before the Americans could blow them up. Anything that slowed his advance was to be eliminated or bypassed. This ruthless focus would lead to atrocities. At the village of Hansfeld early on December 17th, Paper's men overran an American unit, capturing prisoners and vehicles. They also seized American uniforms and equipment, which some Germans wore to cause confusion behind American lines. Later that same day, at the Bognes crossroads near the town of Malmedy, Paper's column encountered an American convoy. A brief firefight erupted, and about 100 American soldiers were captured. These prisoners were herded into a field beside the road. What happened next remains controversial in its details but horrific in its outcome. SS soldiers opened fire on the unarmed prisoners with machine guns and pistols, killing most of them in a matter of minutes. Some Americans survived by pretending to be dead. When the firing stopped and the German column moved on, those survivors crawled away to tell the story of what became known as the Malmedy Massacre. Whether Paper directly ordered this atrocity, or whether it occurred without his knowledge, while he was at the head of the column remains debated. But he was the commander, and command responsibility meant the crime was his regardless of who pulled the triggers. The massacre would haunt him for the rest of his life, making him one of the most wanted German war criminals when the fighting ended. By December 18th, Paper had advanced farther than any other German unit, penetrating more than 30 miles into American territory and approaching the Meuse River. But his Kampfgruppe was now isolated, stretched out along a single road through the forests, with American forces gathering on both flanks. Worse, his fuel situation had become critical. The tanks and vehicles were consuming gasoline faster than expected because of the difficult terrain, the constant maneuvering, the cold weather that made engines inefficient. Paper sent urgent messages back to headquarters demanding fuel deliveries, but the supply trucks could not get through. The roads behind him were clogged with traffic, the American artillery was shelling the supply routes, and there simply was not enough fuel in the entire German system to keep all the advancing units running. Paper realized that unless he captured American fuel very soon, his entire command would grind to a halt, stranded deep in enemy territory. His maps showed several potential American fuel dumps in the area. Intelligence reports indicated a major supply depot at the town of Stavelot, which his advance guard had already captured earlier that day. Paper was not with the advance guard when they took Stavelot. He was farther down the column, dealing with traffic problems and trying to keep his units moving. When he finally reached Stavelot on the evening of December 18th, his officers informed him that they had found an American fuel dump on the outskirts of town. Paper felt a surge of hope. This was exactly what the mission required, exactly what would allow him to continue the advance. He drove immediately to the site, accompanied by a small group of staff officers. What he saw there should have filled him with joy. Rows and rows of fuel drums, thousands of them, stacked beside the road, jerrycans full of gasoline, tanker trucks with their engines still warm. This was enough fuel to power his entire Kampfgruppe for days, enough to reach the Meuse and beyond, enough to keep the offensive alive. Paper walked among the fuel containers as darkness fell on that December evening. His breath made clouds in the freezing air. Snow was beginning to fall, light flakes that caught in his hair and melted on the metal drums. He ordered his men to begin transferring the fuel to his vehicles immediately, to work through the night if necessary to get every tank and half-track refueled. The soldiers set to work, rolling drums, connecting hoses, filling tanks. The smell of gasoline filled the air, sharp and unmistakable. Paper should have felt triumphant. He had captured the prize. He had seized the American fuel. The mission could continue, but something was wrong. As he stood there in the gathering darkness, watching his men work, Paper felt a terrible doubt creeping into his mind, a realization he had been suppressing for months, perhaps for years. The fuel was there, yes, but his Kampfgruppe was already 2 days behind schedule. The weather was supposed to stay bad to keep Allied aircraft grounded, but it was already beginning to clear. The Americans were not collapsing in panic as intelligence had predicted. They were fighting hard, slowing the German advance at dozens of points. Other German units that were supposed to be advancing alongside him had barely moved, leaving his flanks exposed. The roads were impossibly congested, making it almost impossible to bring up supplies or reinforcements. And even with all this captured fuel, Paper knew it would only delay the inevitable. The fundamental equation of the war had not changed. Germany was fighting the combined industrial might of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Germany had no oil fields, no secure supply of rubber, no way to replace the aircraft and tanks being destroyed faster than the factories could build them. The fuel he had captured would run out in a few days, and then what? Capture more fuel. And after that ran out. Keep capturing fuel forever. Paper sat down on a fuel drum, his officers standing nearby, waiting for orders. The snow fell harder now, beginning to accumulate on the ground, beautiful and peaceful in the way that snow always was, indifferent to the war being fought beneath it. Paper had devoted his entire adult life to the Nazi cause. He had believed everything they told him, about racial superiority, about Germany's destiny, about the weakness of the democracies, about the inevitable triumph of will over material. He had killed for this cause, had ordered his men to kill, had burned villages and shot prisoners and done things he knew were crimes but justified in his mind as necessary for victory. And now, sitting in a captured Belgian town with American fuel all around him, he understood with terrible clarity that it had all been for nothing. Germany was not going to win this war. The Ardennes offensive was not going to split the Allies. Even if he personally reached the Meuse River, even if every other German unit achieved its objectives, it would not matter. The war was already lost. The signs had been there for anyone willing to see them. The Soviet Union had not collapsed in 1941 as Hitler promised. America had not stayed neutral but had joined the war with its vast industrial power. The German cities were burning under Allied bombs. The U-boat campaign had failed. The African colonies were lost. Italy had surrendered. The Allies had landed in Normandy and could not be pushed back into the sea. Every day brought new defeats disguised as tactical withdrawals. And yet Paper had refused to see it, had clung to his faith in ultimate victory because admitting defeat meant admitting that his entire worldview was wrong, that the ideology he had embraced was false, that the crimes he had committed were just crimes with no higher purpose to justify them. One of Paper's officers approached and asked for orders. Should they continue the advance tonight? Should they wait until morning? Should they attempt to reach the bridges at the Meuse before the Americans could reinforce them? Paper looked up at the young officer, seeing himself 10 years earlier, full of confidence and certainty, believing absolutely in the righteousness of the cause. He wanted to tell this young man the truth, that they were all doomed, that continuing to fight would only kill more German soldiers for no purpose, that the only sane thing to do was surrender. But he could not say those words. He was an SS colonel, a true believer, a soldier who had sworn an oath to Hitler and to Germany. Personal doubts could not override duty. Even if the war was lost, even if further fighting was pointless, he had to continue. To do otherwise would be to betray everything he had claimed to stand for, to admit that his entire life had been wasted in service to a lie. So Paper gave the orders to refuel and continue the advance. The work went on through the night. By morning, most of his vehicles had full tanks again. The Kampfgruppe resumed its push westward, fighting through American roadblocks, engaging small units of defenders, gradually grinding forward. But the advance was slower now. The Americans were bringing up reinforcements. The weather had cleared enough for Allied aircraft to appear in the skies, strafing the German columns, destroying vehicles, killing soldiers. Paper's radio brought increasingly desperate messages from other German units, all of them behind schedule, all of them running low on fuel, all of them facing stiffening resistance. The great offensive was failing, not dramatically but incrementally, death by 1,000 cuts as the Americans recovered from the initial shock and began to fight back effectively. By December 20th, just 4 days after the offensive began, Paper's Kampfgruppe was trapped in a narrow salient around the town of La Gleize. American forces had cut his supply lines and surrounded his position. He still had tanks, he still had fuel, he still had soldiers willing to fight, but he had no way forward and no way back. His radio contact with German headquarters was sporadic. The messages he received were increasingly disconnected from reality, ordering him to continue advancing when he was surrounded, promising reinforcements and supplies that never arrived, insisting that the offensive was succeeding when Paper could see with his own eyes that it was collapsing. He tried to break out, launching attacks in different directions, but every attempt was beaten back with heavy losses. American artillery pounded his positions constantly. Fighter bombers appeared whenever the weather permitted, rocketing his tanks and supply vehicles. Inside the surrounded perimeter, Paper's soldiers huddled in basements and cellars, sharing their rations with American prisoners they had captured, waiting for orders that made sense. The colonel moved among them, trying to maintain morale, but he could see the doubt in their eyes. These were veteran soldiers, not naive recruits. They understood that being surrounded was usually fatal. They knew the fuel that had seemed so abundant a few days ago was now running low again. They knew that German forces were not going to break through to rescue them. Some of them probably knew, as Paper knew, that Germany was going to lose the war. But military discipline held. The men stayed at their posts, manning their weapons, following orders even when those orders seemed pointless. On December 23rd, Paper made the hardest decision of his military career. He would abandon his vehicles and lead his men out on foot through the American lines. All the heavy equipment, all the tanks and armored cars and artillery that had been the pride of his command, would be destroyed to prevent capture. The wounded who could not walk would be left behind with medical supplies and surrendered to the Americans. Everyone who could still fight would attempt to break out under cover of darkness and make their way back to German lines. It was an admission of total failure. Everything the Kampfgruppe had accomplished, all the ground gained, all the fuel captured, all the sacrifices made, had resulted in nothing but retreat and defeat. Paper gave the orders in a flat, emotionless voice. His officers saluted and moved off to execute the plan. The soldiers methodically destroyed their vehicles, placing explosive charges in the engines, smashing the radios and fire control systems, rendering everything useless. That night, in small groups, the survivors of Kampfgruppe Paper slipped out of La Glise and into the dark forest. They moved silently through the snow, avoiding American positions, navigating by compass and starlight. Paper led one of these groups, carrying a rifle like a common soldier, all his rank and authority reduced to nothing in the face of defeat. They walked for hours through the freezing darkness, stumbling over roots and rocks, supporting the exhausted and injured, expecting at any moment to run into American patrols. Some groups were captured. Others got lost in the forest. But many, including Paper, made it through and eventually reached German lines. When he arrived back at his own headquarters, Paper looked like a ghost, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow, his uniform torn and filthy. He reported to his superiors that his Kampfgruppe no longer existed as a fighting force. The Americans had captured or destroyed all its equipment. The men were scattered, exhausted, and demoralized. While Paper's Kampfgruppe was being destroyed, the entire Ardennes offensive was failing all along the line. Some German units had advanced farther than Paper, but none had reached the Meuse River. The critical bridges remained in American hands. The Allies were rushing reinforcements to the battle area, including the entire Third Army under General George Patton, which disengaged from its positions in the south and wheeled north to strike the German flank. The weather cleared completely, and Allied aircraft filled the skies, attacking German positions, destroying supply convoys, making movement almost impossible during daylight hours. Hitler refused to call off the offensive even when its failure became obvious to everyone. He insisted that the attacks continue, that more resources be committed, that victory was still possible if everyone just fought harder. But the German reserves were exhausted. There were no more divisions to commit, no more fuel to distribute, no more tanks to replace those destroyed. By early January 1945, the Germans were retreating from the bulge they had created in the Allied lines, falling back to their start positions, abandoning the Belgian towns they had temporarily recaptured. The offensive had cost Germany hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of casualties, and the last strategic fuel reserves, all for absolutely nothing. The Western Allies had been delayed by a few weeks, but were now preparing to cross into Germany itself. The Eastern Front was collapsing even faster, with Soviet armies driving toward Berlin. The end was approaching with the inevitability of a falling boulder, and everyone could see it except Hitler and the true believers who still surrounded him. Paper survived the war, though barely. He fought in the last desperate battles defending Germany, watching his country be torn apart by armies advancing from east and west. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Paper was captured by American forces. His name was already on a list of wanted war criminals because of the Malmedy massacre. The Americans put him on trial along with other members of his unit for the murder of prisoners of war. The trial was controversial from the beginning. Some of the defendants claimed they were tortured into confessing. Defense lawyers argued that American soldiers had committed similar crimes that went unprosecuted, but the evidence of mass murder was overwhelming. Bodies had been found. Survivors had testified. Paper was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. He spent years in military prison, waiting for execution while his case went through appeals. The sentence was eventually commuted to life imprisonment, then reduced further as Cold War politics changed attitudes toward former German soldiers. By the early 1950s, with Germany divided and the West needing German support against the Soviet Union, the desire to punish Nazi war criminals had faded. Paper was released from prison in December 1956, having served just 11 years. He was only 41 years old, still relatively young, but the years in prison had aged him. The confident, fanatical SS officer was gone, replaced by a bitter, withdrawn man who struggled to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. Paper found that there was no place for him in post-war Germany. Some former SS men were quietly reintegrated into society, given jobs by sympathetic employers, accepted back into communities that wanted to forget the war. But Paper was too notorious. His name was associated with the Malmedy massacre in the public mind. Survivor groups protested whenever he tried to find employment. He worked briefly for Porsche, the automotive company, but was forced to resign when his past became public. He tried working for Volkswagen with the same result. Every attempt to build a normal life was sabotaged by his wartime record. Some former SS comrades remained loyal to him, helping with money and connections, still believing they had fought for a righteous cause. But Paper himself seemed to have lost his faith. In private conversations recorded by people who knew him in these years, he spoke cynically about the Nazi regime, about Hitler's incompetence, about the crimes committed in Germany's name. The true believer had become a disillusioned cynic who understood too late what he had really been fighting for. Eventually, Paper moved to France, to a small house in the quiet village of Traves in eastern France, where few people knew his identity. He worked as a translator and lived quietly, keeping to himself, trying to disappear into anonymity. For a while, it worked. He spent his days reading, writing, and caring for his property. He corresponded with other former SS officers, helping to write and edit publications that tried to rehabilitate the reputation of the Waffen-SS. These publications portrayed the SS as professional soldiers who had nothing to do with the Holocaust, who had fought honorably for their country, who were unjustly demonized by the victors. It was historical revisionism at its most blatant, an attempt to separate the military SS from the crimes of the organization. Paper knew it was nonsense. He had been at the highest levels of the SS. He knew exactly what the organization had done, but he participated in the myth-making anyway, perhaps because admitting the full truth would have meant admitting he had wasted his life serving evil. In the late 1970s, someone identified Paper's location and informed communist activists in France. These activists, many of them members of the French Communist Party, saw Paper as a symbol of unpunished Nazi war crimes. They began a campaign to have him expelled from France, writing articles in leftist newspapers, organizing protests, and calling for action against the Nazi living in their country. The local authorities were reluctant to act. Paper had broken no French laws. He had lived quietly and peacefully for years. Expelling him seemed both legally questionable and potentially dangerous, as it might provoke his supporters, but the pressure kept building. Paper received death threats. Graffiti appeared on his property. Unknown individuals shouted abuse at him in the village. On the night of July 13, 1976, Bastille Day in France, someone set fire to Paper's house. The wooden structure burned quickly. Paper was alone inside, his wife and family having moved away earlier due to the threats. Whether he was unable to escape or chose not to escape remains unknown. When firefighters finally controlled the blaze and searched the ruins, they found his charred body in the wreckage. He had died at age 61, burned to death in a house fire that was almost certainly arson, though no one was ever charged with the crime. The irony was inescapable. Paper had burned villages during the war, had ordered executions, had participated in atrocities. Now he had died by fire himself, killed by people who saw themselves as delivering justice for his crimes. Some of his former comrades claimed he had been murdered by Jewish revenge squads. Others blamed communist terrorists. The truth was probably simpler. He had been killed by local activists who saw an opportunity to rid their community of a notorious Nazi on a night when fires and fireworks were common due to the holiday celebrations. Throughout his post-war life, Paper rarely spoke publicly about that moment in December 1944, when he stood among the captured American fuel drums and realized Germany was doomed. But in private conversations, in letters to trusted friends, he returned to it again and again. The fuel became a symbol for him, a representation of everything wrong with the Nazi regime and its war. Hitler had launched an offensive that depended on capturing enemy supplies, because Germany lacked the resources to sustain its own operations. The strategy was not based on strength, but on desperation, on gambling that the enemy would be incompetent enough to let their supplies be captured. It was the military equivalent of a bankrupt gambler betting everything on one last hand of cards, hoping for a miracle to save him from ruin. And Paper had believed it would work. He had believed right up until the moment when he stood among those fuel drums and could no longer ignore reality. The fuel was there, the prize was won, but it changed nothing. The fundamental weakness remained. Germany could not produce enough oil, could not build enough tanks, could not train enough pilots, could not match the industrial output of its enemies. All the ideology, all the propaganda, all the talk of superior will and racial destiny meant nothing against the simple mathematics of production capacity. The Americans could afford to lose fuel dumps because they had vast oil fields in Texas and Oklahoma, pumping millions of barrels every month. Germany had no such resources and could not survive a war of attrition against enemies who did. Paper's realization at the fuel dump was personal, but it reflected a larger truth that many Germans were discovering in the final months of the war. The Nazi regime had built its entire strategy on blitzkrieg, on quick victories achieved before the enemy could mobilize their full strength. It had worked in Poland, in France, in the Balkans, but it had failed in the Soviet Union, where the distances were too vast and the resources too deep to be overcome by speed alone. It had failed against Britain, which refused to surrender even when standing alone, and it was failing catastrophically against the United States, whose industrial power dwarfed Germany's. By late 1944, German factories were producing weapons at record rates despite Allied bombing, but it was not enough. For every tank Germany built, America built 5. For every aircraft Germany produced, the Soviets produced 10. The soldiers at the front understood this better than the leaders in Berlin. They saw the endless streams of Allied aircraft overhead, the massive artillery barrages that preceded every attack, the new tanks and trucks that equipped enemy units while German forces made do with horse-drawn wagons. They knew they were being outproduced, outsupplied, and slowly overwhelmed. But military discipline and Nazi indoctrination kept them fighting. Desertion was punishable by death. Defeatist talk could get a soldier shot by SS enforcers, and many, like Paper, had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they could not imagine a world where Germany lost, where the Reich collapsed, where everything they had been taught was revealed as lies. The cognitive dissonance was too great, so they kept fighting, kept following orders, kept hoping for the miracle weapons and wonder tactics that propaganda promised would turn the tide. Joachim Paper's story is the story of fanaticism confronting reality and being destroyed by it. He had been the perfect Nazi, the ideal SS officer, intelligent, brave, ruthless, and absolutely committed to the cause. He had risen through the ranks, earned medals and decorations, commanded elite units, and fought in the most critical battles. And all of it had led to that moment in Belgium when he stood among captured fuel drums and understood that he had wasted his life serving a regime that was doomed to fail. The tragedy was not just personal but generational. Millions of young Germans had been like Paper, raised in the Hitler Youth, indoctrinated in Nazi schools, taught to believe in racial superiority and territorial expansion. They had fought and died for these beliefs, committing terrible crimes along the way, convinced that they were building a 1,000-year Reich that would dominate Europe forever. The Reich lasted 12 years. It collapsed in total defeat, its cities in ruins, its population traumatized, its territory occupied by foreign armies. The ideology that had promised glory delivered only destruction. The racial theories that claimed superiority were revealed as murderous nonsense. The military strategies that were supposed to guarantee victory led to the worst defeat in German history. And soldiers like Paper, who had believed absolutely and served faithfully, were left with nothing but guilt, bitterness, and the knowledge that they had been fools. Some of them, like Paper, eventually acknowledged the truth about what they had done and who they had served. Others went to their graves still insisting they had fought honorably for a just cause, unable or unwilling to face reality even when the evidence was overwhelming. From the American side, the capture and loss of fuel dumps during the Battle of the Bulge was a serious concern, but not a strategic disaster. The United States had built a supply system of unprecedented scale to support its forces in Europe. Fuel was shipped across the Atlantic in tankers, pumped through pipelines, stored in massive depots, and distributed to front-line units in a continuous flow. Losing one dump, or even several dumps, to German raiders was unfortunate but manageable. The Americans simply brought up more fuel from their inexhaustible reserves. This was the fundamental difference between the two sides. Germany fought a war of scarcity, where every liter of fuel, every tank, every artillery shell had to be carefully rationed and used efficiently. America fought a war of abundance, where supplies were so plentiful that losses were barely noticed. The soldiers who fought against Paper's Kampfgruppe experienced the battle very differently than he did. For them, the initial shock of the German offensive gave way to determination and effective resistance. American units that were surrounded held their positions and forced the Germans to waste time reducing them. Engineers blew up bridges and blocked roads, slowing the German advance. Artillery units fired until their ammunition ran out, then retreated to fire again from new positions. And once the initial confusion passed, the American command system proved flexible and responsive, moving units to threatened sectors, coordinating counterattacks, and gradually containing the German penetration. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest battle the American army fought in Europe, but it was a battle they won, albeit at a terrible cost in casualties. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major offensive operation of the war, and its failure sealed the Third Reich's fate. Hitler had gambled everything on splitting the Western Allies and forcing them to negotiate, and he had lost. The resources consumed in the Ardennes could not be replaced. The divisions destroyed could not be reconstituted. The fuel expended left nothing for defending against the Soviet offensive that would soon crash into Germany from the east. Within weeks of the battle's end, Soviet forces were on the Oder River, just 50 miles from Berlin. Within months, Hitler was dead by his own hand in a bunker beneath the ruined capital, and Germany was surrendering unconditionally to the Allies. The war that was supposed to create a 1,000-year empire had instead destroyed Germany completely, leaving it divided, occupied, and traumatized for generations. Paper's moment of realization at the fuel dump has become symbolic of the broader German experience in World War II. The moment when propaganda met reality and shattered. It was the moment when belief in inevitable victory confronted the mathematical impossibility of achieving it. It was the moment when ideology proved insufficient to overcome material disadvantage. And it was the moment when the lies that had sustained the Nazi regime began to unravel in the minds of those who had believed them most fervently. Not every German soldier experienced such a moment of clarity. Many died still believing in the cause. Many others simply followed orders without thinking deeply about the strategic situation. But for those like Paper who did experience that realization, it was devastating, a complete collapse of the worldview that had given their lives meaning and purpose. In the frozen forests of Belgium, amid the snow and the blood and the wreckage of war, Joachim Paper stood among American fuel drums and felt his world collapse. The fuel he had captured was real, the victory was tangible, but it meant nothing. Germany was going to lose the war not because its soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because the regime had started a fight it could never win, against enemies whose resources were simply too vast to overcome. All the propaganda, all the ideology, all the promises of inevitable triumph were revealed as hollow lies in that single moment of clarity. Paper would live for 30 more years after that December night, but in a sense his life ended there, among those fuel drums, when he understood that everything he had fought for was doomed. He had wasted his youth serving evil, committed crimes that could never be undone, and sacrificed his honor for a cause that was rotten from its inception. The story of Paper and the captured fuel is a story about the dangers of fanaticism, about what happens when people believe so completely in an ideology that they blind themselves to reality. It is a story about how even the most dedicated believers can have their faith shattered when confronted with undeniable truth. And it is a story about the terrible price of serving evil, even when that service is motivated by genuine belief rather than cynical opportunism. Paper was not a cartoon villain who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake. He was an intelligent, capable man who genuinely believed he was fighting for something noble, for his country's survival and greatness. But belief does not make something true, and sincerity does not excuse crimes. The fuel he captured could power his tanks for a few more days, but it could not power the illusion that Germany was going to win. That illusion died in Belgium in December 1944, killed by the simple reality of American industrial might and German resource poverty. The legacy of that moment extends far beyond one colonel's personal crisis of faith. It represents the moment when Nazi Germany's last great gamble failed, when the final offensive collapsed, when the end became inevitable and visible to everyone. The Battle of the Bulge bought Hitler a few more months, but it could not buy him victory. The fuel that Paper captured and then lost symbolized everything wrong with Germany's strategic position, dependent on capturing enemy supplies because domestic production was insufficient, gambling on enemy mistakes because German strength was inadequate, fighting to postpone defeat rather than achieve victory. In the end, Paper's realization was correct. Germany was doomed from the moment it started a multi-front war against industrially superior enemies. The only question was how long the dying would take and how many would die before the inevitable surrender. Paper survived to see that surrender and to spend the rest of his life living with the knowledge that his service, his crimes, and his sacrifices had all been for nothing but a mad dream that turned into a nightmare for millions. The fuel dumps of Belgium were the place where that nightmare's end became undeniable, where reality broke through the walls of propaganda and delusion, and where one true believer finally understood the terrible truth he had been avoiding for years.